Jessica Tarlov, perhaps the only sane voice on the Fox Propaganda Network, was a guest on Special Report with Bret Baier, an allegedly straight news Fox program hosted by an alleged straight news anchor. But her appearance only confirmed that the network is incapable of responsible journalism, even when the likes of Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity are nowhere to be found. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, got a few clips to play, but this one here is really good. It takes us out of the 5. That's usually where our queen, Jessica Tarlov, can be found. She's fending off the insane, MAGA-sympathizing rhetoric from the likes of Jeanine Pirro and Jesse Waters and Greg Gutfeld and Dana Perino to a lesser extent. As we talked about, it should be called 4v1 or whatever, but she is outside of that particular venue here. She's on Special Report with Bret Baier. And I was really excited because allegedly, Bret Baier is still a credible journalist. He was once considered one of the Holy Trinity along with Chris Wallace and Shep Smith, adding a degree of credibility to the Fox Propaganda Network. And yet, Shep Smith and Chris Wallace, they're long gone, and Bret Baier has come, I think, rightly under scrutiny for whatever journalistic credibility that he has left, because he's lacking. And if you have any doubts about this, just watch this clip and we'll unpack it together.
And then you look at an incumbent where you have stalwarts in their party saying, I really hope he doesn't run. The Wall Street Journal saying it's selfish. David Axelrod saying what he's saying. But then all of a sudden the pushback is pretty clear. Trump, Nazi, we already had that last week. The Atlantic writing, has anyone noticed how old Donald Trump is? That was the story that just broke a little while ago. And they go down to a few things that he said, that he's 77 years old. The thing that stands out to me is the independents. Only 30% approve of what he's doing. And I just worry about this. Within the Israeli war, we are looking at Biden putting his ire on the West Bank, on the Israelis, and a frustration among our troops that they're being targeted in Iraq and Syria, and all we're hitting is empty depots. Our guys are right in the middle of the thick of things and saying, are we going to get permission from this president to defend ourselves?
Can I say something quickly, though, about the coverage of this? So, first of all, it does matter that Donald Trump is 77 years old. And the way that his age manifests is that he sounds more childlike. He forgets things all the time. He confuses who's in office. And,
after an hour speech. After an hour speech.
I don't care. It's a harder job than just an hour.
Right.
And the point about The Atlantic and other publications comparing him to a Nazi, when he called leftists vermin, he was echoing how Adolf Hitler talked and how Mussolini spoke.
Do you think he's a student, but Joy, he's a student of history?
You know what I think?
Donald Trump is a student of
I
history?
think Stephen Miller told him that that's the kind of language that you should use.
This morning, we did the disapproval number where Biden is today as compared to Obama.
And they actually just move on. They actually move on. So Bret Baier, who's the host of this, doesn't actually stop and want to discuss this, the fact that the Republican presidential frontrunner, a former president of the United States himself, the leader of the Republican Party, is openly using Nazi rhetoric. You see Brian Kilmeade there, who is obviously not a journalist in any respect. He is a commentator. He's a Trump-supporting sympathizer, making excuses. Well, sure, Donald Trump forgot who was president, but that was after, an hour. Do you think he would cut President Biden any slack if President Biden made a gaffe like that? Of course not. And then you have Bill Hemmer, who is more of a journalist, again, at least on paper, than Brian Kilmeade. He's in Dana Perino territory. He just changes the subject, and Bret Baier doesn't go back and confront it. And the thing is, this actually isn't anything new. We discussed this briefly a couple of days ago, but after Donald Trump made his fascistic remarks, and there's a clip here at the bottom as a bit of a refresher, Fox News basically glossed over it, including the supposed straight journalist. As a matter of fact, we do have a clip here of Bret Baier, along with Brit Hume and others, actually discussing this, and it was talked about for like 2 minutes. Okay, so I want to play this clip, and again, we'll unpack it together.
Biggest political news that got a lot of attention, Brit, was from the president's speech over the weekend, Saturday in New Hampshire, talking about his political enemies, former president, I should say. Take a listen.
We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections and will do anything possible. They'll do anything, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America.
Washington Post, Bret, said this: Trump calls political enemies vermin, echoing dictators Hitler and Mussolini. Goes on to talk to historians and effectively using the language of Hitler and Mussolini, and there's a lot of coverage of that, Bret. What's your thoughts on that and the framing of it?
Well, I don't see Hitler and Mussolini. We had 4 years of Trump. We didn't get Hitler or Mussolini out of it, although he behaved in a way that was, many people thought, reprehensible and unbecoming a president. But you notice there, Bret, the thing that struck me was he always gets around to complaining about that stolen election, and he has campaigned basically on that for a long time. It hasn't hurt his support in the Republican Party, but in a general election, I think it would be harmful to him to keep talking about that because it's too little, too late, and most people don't believe it.
Yeah, Byron, quickly, there are concerns about a second Trump administration on the front of going after political enemies. There have been multiple stories about that, with just no comment about it from the campaign or the former president.
Yeah, well, we have known the president is, the former president, if he gets back in office, is planning to use the Justice Department much more aggressively against some political opponents because he feels that's exactly what has been done to him. Whether he would actually do it in office, we just don't know.
That's it. That is all they say. That's all they have to say about it. And this is from Bret Baier, again, who was basically the last vestige of journalistic credibility on the Fox Propaganda Network. Media Matters discussed this. They spent only 4 minutes on Trump's vermin rant, repeatedly downplaying the remarks. Just imagine a counterfactual in which President Biden or a prominent Democrat said anything like that. Imagine the coverage. It would get wall-to-wall, nonstop coverage. They'd have to open like another subsidiary. They would have to like squeeze in another Fox channel. It wouldn't be Fox News and Fox Business. It would be a third Fox channel just to cover that remark in its entirety. There is no journalistic credibility left at the Fox Propaganda Network. Jessica Tarlov's appearance, in which, again, she raises these concerns, she refutes brilliantly what Brian Kilmeade has to say. Bill Hemmer and Bret Baier have nothing to say. As a matter of fact, Bill Hemmer tries to change the subject. It's absolutely despicable. It really is. It's an abdication of journalistic credibility, of responsible journalism. It shouldn't matter what the particular party affiliation of the person saying it. If a Democrat ever said anything like what Trump said and didn't apologize for it or anything like that, I would want it to be covered extensively because that person would be profoundly dangerous, particularly if they wielded the kind of power and influence like Donald Trump. But it's an asymmetry. We just don't see that in the Democratic Party. This is unique. This is exclusive to the Republican Party. And people like Bret Baier know it. And even people like Brian Kilmeade, you can tell he knows it too because he mentions it and he kind of like acknowledges it, but then he quickly brushes past it. If he were so confident on that particular point, if he felt that Donald Trump were justified in saying the things that he said, he would stand and defend it, especially when, as Brian Kilmeade points out, others are talking about it. CNN's finally talking about it. New York Times are finally talking about it. MSNBC is talking about it. So he would want to defend Trump stalwartly in that particular position, but he doesn't because he knows he's screwed. He can't defend Trump's rhetoric in good faith. And so Jessica Tarlov is pointing out, listen, it is important to point out that Donald Trump is only 3 years younger than President Biden. It is important to, when Trump uses Nazi rhetoric, to say it explicitly, to call it out as Nazi rhetoric, and people shouldn't apologize for it. But again, you would think after the Dominion settlement, for example, that wake-up call in which they nearly had to pay, they paid nearly, they did pay, it wasn't that they nearly paid, they paid nearly $800 million. You would think that there would have been a hard reset at the Fox Propaganda Network. Like, you know what? Maybe we really do need to buff up our journalistic credibility. Maybe we should take this job a bit more seriously. And yet it seems like they have no interest in that whatsoever. Let me know what you think in the comments section about Jessica Tarlov's performance. And I would argue even more importantly, Bret Baier and Brian Kilmeade and Bill Hemmer's despicable performance. Let me know what you think.